Okay, can you all hear me? Anyone not hear me? No. Good. So hi everybody, my name's Amy. I work for Green Alliance, which is an organisation you've probably not heard of. We're an environmental think tank, but we have historically done lots of work with other NGOs in the environmental sector. And before the EU referendum last year, we did quite a bit of scenario planning with some of those other NGOs, and then finding ourselves in pretty much the worst case scenario for environmental policy on June the 23rd, we all got together and thought, actually, this demand, the scale of the sort of risk involved in this process is so great that we need to form a new coalition and work together at a level that we haven't done before. So hence the Greener UK coalition was born. And I've been asked here today to talk a bit about what this means for environmental policy, what the Brexit process means for environmental policy, which is the sort of, I guess, kind of macro environment in which all your awesome efforts to green your events and festivals is taking place. This is going to be a very UK-focused talk, because that's the sort of audience that the Greener UK coalition is mostly is focused on. But I think it should be of interest to those of you who are from other countries as well, particularly other countries in the EU, because if the UK gets this wrong, and actually if the EU 27 get it wrong as well in letting the negotiations sort of disintegrate and not maintaining a good level of environmental cooperation, then the UK could turn into a bit of a kind of pariah on the side of Europe that's like reducing its standards, starting a race to the bottom, which could drag down other countries as well. So there really are, sorry, that's really miserable, but we're working on it, okay? We're working on it. That's why we've formed this coalition. So just to give you the bit of context, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is even before the referendum, the UK environment was not in a great state. Nature was struggling. We're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. We've got some good climate change targets, but we're not on track to meet them. And so what Brexit does, or what the referendum does, is introduce another layer of uncertainty on top of that. Because 80% of our environmental law stems from EU law. So how we transpose that over becomes a really big question. And it's not just the word of the law itself, it's not just the standards in itself, the recycling targets and so on, it's also how that's enforced. So we have, if you take something like chemicals regulations make no sense outside the context of the European Chemicals Agency over in Helsinki. That they're the guys who help companies comply with regulation affecting thousands of chemicals. They have all the expertise, they know how to do it. If the UK pulls out of that, keeps the standards, say, but doesn't keep the enforcement and the help with compliance that agency provides, then what do those standards really mean? So you get this phrase there, which academic called Andy Jordan called zombie legislation. So the standards are still there, but there's no enforcement on them, and there's also no sort of dynamism to them. So a lot of these standards get updated over time. Potentially, just depending on how we extract ourselves from the EU, potentially we lose that dynamism as well. I've just made a note about climate policy there because it's a bit less affected than a lot of areas of environmental policy because we have our own domestic targets and our own domestic enforcement processes. However, a lot of how we implement climate policy, how we actually meet those targets, is very much affected by the EU. So our ability to trade electricity with the continent, for example, the energy efficiency targets and the renewables targets as well. So it's not a great sort of starting point. And I've just included that news article about the air quality court case that a fantastic organisation called Client Earth won recently as an example of that enforcement point. So we have these air quality standards, London is flouting them, and it's only because of ultimately the European Court of Justice that can impose fines on the UK government that the government is now building a new air quality plan to try and respond to the fact that London's air quality is like, it's sometimes just tastes really bad. Like, there was some days recently when I was like, ugh, you know, you step outside and it's horrendous. So we don't want that. And it's really important to keep those accountability mechanisms. So the coalition is, it's got a lot of the sort of probably recognisable brands like everyone from Greenpeace to the National Trust. We also have a lot of supporter organisations, and then we're working with some of the big environmental networks that already exist, like Sustain, the Alliance for Food and Farming, Wildlife and Countryside Link, and the Climate Coalition. So we want this all to be very joined up. We're not sort of awash with resources and people, so we need to make sure that we're using everything as well as we can be. Oops! Didn't mean to do that. What have I done? Sorry. I think I pressed the wrong button. How about if I just go like that? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so what we said when we got together was we're not going to affect the type of Brexit that we have. We're not going to affect, as the environmental community, whether we stay in the single market or stay in the customs union or any of that stuff. But what we do want to make sure is that, sorry, have I gone right back to the beginning? Sorry, that's all.
Well, I went right back to the beginning. Okay. Just the diversion, I'll never know.
That's fine. Is that the environmental outcomes are good. So whatever type of Brexit we have, we need to, thank you, I'll try and use this more carefully in future. We need to be focused on the big prize, which is restoring nature and natural resources. And so the way that we've sort of interpreted that in terms of our own priorities is up there. So not just transposing over the standards, but actually raising our ambition about those standards, securing our climate leadership, and working to improve particularly farming policies, which have been sort of hamstrung by the Common Agricultural Policy for a long time. So actually, that's probably the area of biggest opportunity, is what happens with CAP, although a lot of kind of potential risk involved in that as well. So I thought I'd just whiz through some of the stuff that's happened so far in the light of a sort of environmental perspective. Oh, I'm going to do it again. I don't really trust myself with this. I'm just going to use this. Okay. So we had the Prime Minister did a conference speech back in October, which was the first bit of information that we had about what this process would look like. She said, we're going to invoke Article 50, triggering the 2-year exit process by the end of March. The government says they're still on track for that. But also, importantly, she announced a so-called Great Repeal Bill, or gerbil, as it is known amongst some, to ensure that you have regulatory continuity. So this will be introduced into Parliament this year, and the idea is that on Brexit Day, so the day that the Article 50 process is finished and we've left the EU, everything feels the same. So all the waste regulations stay the same, and all the climate targets stay the same. And obviously it's not that simple. As actually became quickly clear when the Secretary of State for DEFRA stood in front of the Environmental Audit Committee and said, yeah, we think that's going to be straightforward for about 2/3 to 3/4 of our environmental policy, and the rest is a bit more complicated. And some of that is because it's so tied in with European agencies like the chemicals case study that I mentioned earlier. So that's already a difficult task. Then we had a big gap with not much news. And then in January, the Prime Minister did a speech on Brexit, which consciously, I think you could read the greater influence of Boris Johnson versus the sort of kind of hard Brexiteer version of the conference speech that had been in October. So it was much more kind of trying to be friendly, like we still care about the world, we're still global Britain. It's just we're going to do that outside the EU, and we think the EU is really important, it's just we don't want to be a part of it. So it was kind of mixed messaging, but for me the big point was that the environment was not mentioned at all in that speech, and that was really significant because it was a speech where the Prime Minister said, we're moving into a world of deal making. We're going to be all about trade deals. We're also going to completely, go out of the EU and then make a deal for a new type of relationship. So what happens in deal making? There's give and take. And if you don't say right from the beginning, environment is okay, we're not going to trade away our environmental protections, then immediately you start worrying that, okay, maybe you're going to trade away some of those in order to get deals on cars or the city or whatever your stated priorities are. There was a bit more reassurance on that in the white paper that was published a bit later, on a really top-line way, saying we will protect our environmental protections and our climate leadership will continue. But there's a lot of questions about actually how that happens. Just a couple of good, if you really want to get into the geeky stuff, there's a couple of good reports here, one from a House of Lords committee, one from a House of Commons committee, on the impacts on environment and climate change in particular, and they both made this case about the governance gap, the enforcement gap. So that's a sort of narrative that's building slowly. So what has Greener UK been doing? We started off right in the summer with an objective, a sort of short-term objective of just making sure that there was this baseline commitment to maintain our environmental protections as we leave the EU. And part of doing that was to get MPs to sign a pledge stating that in quite very kind of top-line terms. This is on our website, by the way, www.greeneruk.org.uk, maybe. I'm sure if you Google Greener UK, find it. We've hit the 200 mark. So there's quite a significant amount of MP sort of support for this in kind of a top-line way. The next, the real need going forward is to look at how we can mobilise those MPs when it comes to the repeal bill and really scrutinising that from an environmental perspective and making sure that nothing's slipping through the gaps, which is going to be a kind of monumental piece of work because it's so darn complicated. Then we did a public launch in December with an advert in the Times and a letter to the Times, and just recently launched our manifesto, which sets out 8 priorities for the environmental community during the Brexit process. So that's on the website as well. And then going into 4 areas in more detail, so climate and energy, food and farming, marine and fisheries, and nature and pollution standards. These are all on the website as well if you want a bit more info about our priorities on those particular areas. They're just some nice tweets. Okay, so looking ahead, we might have Article 50 invoked next week. I think that was the latest estimate, maybe on the 15th. Then the negotiations start. My perspective on this is that actually there's so much obvious mutual interest in continued cooperation on environmental policy from the UK's perspective and from the EU 27's perspective, that in a way, why don't you just agree all that first and get to know each other in the process, get to understand how these negotiations are going to work, and then put it to one side and be like, okay, done. That if I was in charge of the negotiations, that might be what I did. I doubt that the actual government will do that, but we're going to be making that case and sort of highlighting all the areas where there's a mutual interest in continued cooperation. Because this was not the reason why people voted to leave the EU, I think it's safe to say. We, the UK, could negotiate continued access to some of those EU programmes and institutions like the Chemicals Agency, like maybe the Food Standards Agency, and the same with the Energy Union, which makes it a lot easier to decarbonise. Go into that, but I won't. But there's one of the big risks is how the UK decides to position itself between the 2 big poles of international trade policy. So basically, there's 2 trade superpowers, as my colleague Sam at Friends of the Earth likes to say. So there's the EU and there's the US, and they have different ways of doing policy, different ways of doing trade policy, and basically the countries with which they form agreements sort of come into line with those. With their way of doing it. So TTIP was all about trying to harmonise those 2 very different ways of doing policy, and it basically failed because it was so difficult. And so the UK is now in this position where it's very aligned with the EU way of doing things, but it could pivot to the US way of doing things. And the US I think would be very keen for that to happen, because if the US gets the UK within its orbit, maybe it can then bring the EU within its orbit as well. So, and from an environmental perspective, that's quite worrying, because things like washing chicken in chlorine and giving hormones to cows, and not a very smart way of regulating chemicals, that could all come over here and leave us not very well off from a sort of environmental integrity point of view. Oh, and another complexity is devolution. Most environmental policy is devolved, most trade policy is reserved. There's going to be tensions that arise within that, which I probably don't have time to go into. So here's what we want from the repeal bill, which I mentioned is going to be our main focus going forward. Converting all environmental law and principles, some of those really important principles like the precautionary principle and the principle that polluters pay for their pollution, are enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, the treaty for the EU, which we're not going to transpose. So what happens to those principles? So we think it's very important that we bring those across, as well as the standards and everything that's in most of the environmental law. We need to make sure that Parliament has a full role in any substantial changes to those standards and laws, and we need to make sure that where we're not having ongoing governance relationships with the EU and its agencies, that we're replacing those functions. I think that's always going to be an imperfect sort of scenario, even if we try our hardest to replace them, just because the EU can hold national governments to account. It's very difficult for national governments to hold themselves to account in that same way. And then let's go further and raise ambition. And if we're going to be doing things by ourselves in the UK, let's at least do that in an exciting way that tells a really good story about how you build a thriving economy next to a really resilient natural world. And that's the hopey changey bit. We don't just want everything to stay the same, because it wasn't perfect as it was even while we were in the EU. We need to go further and raise our ambition and then show how to meet it. That's the end.